There is a certain kind of quiet that comes after 70. Not the peaceful kind, the other kind. The kind where you notice that whole days go by and you haven't really said anything. Not anything that required you to think. Not anything that made someone else think. You ordered coffee. You answered, fine, when someone asked. You watched the news alone and disagreed with it in silence. And something in you, something you wouldn't say out loud, wonders if that quietness is becoming permanent. About 8 minutes from now, we'll arrive at what the Harvard study of adult development found after following the same people for over 80 years, one of the longest studies of human life ever conducted. They were looking at what keeps the mind sharp past 70. They expected the usual answers. What they found instead was something most people over 70 have quietly stopped doing, without ever making a decision to stop. What we're going to look at today is deceptively simple. Simple enough that most people dismiss it before they finish the thought. But the research keeps pointing at it, quietly, across decades of study. It's not memory games, not crossword puzzles, not diet. But first, let's start with a man named Merle. Merle is 71 years old. He spent 34 years teaching high school biology in a mid-sized town in Ohio, the kind of school where he knew every student by name, where former students would stop him in the grocery store a decade later and say, "You were the reason I went into medicine." He retired 3 years ago. His wife Carol died 14 months after that. Now, every morning at 7:30, rain or shine, Merle walks his dog, a slow, arthritic beagle named Hector, down the same 4 blocks to a small park with a green iron bench near the fountain. He sits there for exactly 20 minutes. Hector investigates the same patch of grass. Merle watches the light move through the trees. Some mornings, a woman named Ruth passes by with her grandchildren. They wave, he waves back. And that is, often, the entirety of what Merle says out loud before noon. He doesn't think of himself as lonely. That word feels too dramatic, too self-pitying, for a man who has always been quietly self-sufficient. What he notices is something smaller than loneliness, a kind of dimming. He used to come home from school so full of conversation he could barely get through the door. Someone always needed explaining to. Someone always had a question that made him think harder than he expected. His mind was always a little out of breath. Now, it just settles. He doesn't know if that's wisdom or something else. What Merle didn't know, and what most people don't, is that researchers had a name for exactly what he was losing. And it wasn't loneliness. Most of us understand, in a general way, that staying connected matters as we age. We've heard it, we believe it, loosely. And then we go another week without a real conversation. Not a transaction, not pleasantries about the weather or what's on television. A real conversation, the kind where you have to listen carefully, where you have to search for exactly the right word, where the other person says something unexpected and it changes what you were about to say next. That kind of conversation becomes increasingly rare after retirement. Not because people are unkind, because life contracts, the children are busy, the circle gets smaller. The routines that once pulled you into daily contact with other minds, the job, the carpool, the noise and friction of a full house, those structures disappear. And what replaces them, often, is comfort, familiar rhythms, days that ask very little. And here is the quiet ache in that it feels like rest, for a while, maybe a long while. But there is a difference between rest and retreat. Rest restores you. Retreat, over time, does something else, something quieter and harder to name. When the mind is not regularly asked to track a real conversation, to hold an idea, respond to it, revise it in real time based on what someone just said, it practices less of the very thing that keeps it sharp, not all at once. Gradually, the way a path through the woods disappears when people stop walking it. And what the researchers found, when they looked closely, at who was actually staying sharp and who wasn't pointed somewhere. Most people don't look first. Think about the last time you had a conversation that left you feeling genuinely alive, not entertained, alive. Note: the kind where you were thinking hard, tracking something nuanced, choosing your words more carefully than usual. When was that? For many people past 70, the honest answer requires a pause. Not because they aren't intelligent or curious, but because the architecture of daily life no longer delivers that kind of exchange automatically. It used to. Work delivered it. Raising children delivered it. Neighborhoods where people actually knew each other, where the man at the corner hardware store remembered what project you'd been working on last month, delivered it. There was a time when mental engagement came to you. You didn't have to seek it out. That time has passed. What researchers studying cognitive health have found, consistently, across long-term studies of aging populations, is that the brain does not age the same way in everyone. Some people in their 80s remain remarkably sharp. Others lose significant function much earlier. And one of the clearest differences between those two groups is not purely genetic. It's not entirely about which supplements they took or how many miles they walked each week. It's about whether the mind was regularly placed in situations that demanded active, genuine response, not passive. Not watching something where you simply receive, active, back and forth, the kind of engagement that requires you to think and then think again when something pushes back. And inside that finding, there's something even more specific that the researchers themselves didn't fully anticipate. How many days in the last week did someone, another real person, in real time, ask you something that made you actually stop and think? Let that land quietly. The answer, the researchers found, wasn't about how many people you know. It was about something more precise than that, and it will change how you think about the relationships already in your life. The Harvard study of adult development spent over 80 years following the same group of participants through adulthood. It is one of the most comprehensive studies of human aging ever conducted. And what the researchers found about cognitive health was something they didn't entirely expect. It wasn't the number of relationships that predicted how well the brain aged. It was the depth of them. More specifically, and this is the part that shifted their thinking, they found that the presence of even one relationship in which a person felt both genuinely heard and genuinely challenged made a measurable difference over time. Not just warmly liked, engaged with, a relationship where the other person pushed back sometimes, asked harder questions, didn't always agree. The kind of connection that carries real friction, the respectful kind. The kind born from someone taking you seriously enough to say, "I'm not sure I think that's right." That specific quality challenge within trust appeared again and again as a marker for longer cognitive vitality. Not comfort alone. Challenge, not just warmth. Engagement. The brain, it turns out, doesn't only need to feel safe, it needs resistance. The gentle kind. The kind that lives in a conversation with someone who respects you too much to simply nod along. Think about the people in your life. Not all of them. Just the ones who, after you've talked with them, leave you feeling like your mind ran a mile it didn't know it needed to run. Those people are doing something for your brain that no supplement, no puzzle, no amount of walking can fully replicate. And the habit, the daily habit, that most people over 70 have quietly let go of is the intentional seeking out of that kind of exchange. Not once a month. Not when it happens to arise by chance, deliberately, as a practice. The same way you might decide to take a walk each morning, choosing instead to have one real conversation in person, by phone. It doesn't matter where something is genuinely at stake, where you might be wrong, where you might leave slightly different than you arrived. Merle thought about this without knowing the research. He thought about it one cold morning on the green iron bench, watching Hector sniff at a sparrow who had no intention of flying. He realized that the last person who had ever genuinely disagreed with him, who had pushed back on something he believed and made him better for it, had been Carol. And he missed that more than he had language for. So, he called his daughter that evening, not to check in, to ask her what she actually thought about something that mattered to him, something he'd been turning over alone for weeks. And when she told him, and really told him, carefully, with a little friction in it, he felt something in his chest he recognized from a long time ago. His mind briefly out of breath again. The habit is this: one real conversation this week with someone who won't simply agree with you. That is all of it. Let me explain why that's harder and more important than it sounds. You don't need to restructure your life. You don't need to join a group, sign up for anything, or perform wellness in any visible way. It could be an old friend you haven't called because you didn't want to be a bother. It could be an adult child you've been talking at rather than truly with. It could be a neighbor you've kept at the surface with because the surface felt safe. There is a kind of self-protection that makes complete sense after a certain age, and you've earned the right to a quieter life. But there is a cost when that peace becomes total. The mind that is never asked to stretch, never placed in a conversation where it has to search, revise, reconsider, gradually loses the ease with which it stretches, not in a way you'd point to on a single day. More like a screen door stiffening on its hinges when no one opens it for a season. The good news is that hinges can be oiled. One conversation this week with someone who respects you enough to occasionally tell you when they think you're wrong, that is the habit. Small enough to seem like nothing. Significant enough that decades of research keep pointing quietly back to it. I wonder sometimes about the conversations people carry around, the ones they mean to have but keep postponing, the friend they haven't called, the question they've never asked their children, the thing they've been thinking about for months that they haven't said out loud to anyone yet. Is there someone in your life who used to push back on you, who made your mind work harder that you haven't really talked with in a while? I'd genuinely like to know. If something here gave you a moment of quiet recognition, there's more here whenever you're ready. Something new every week. Something worth sitting with.